Hey y'all, my name is Kai.
My name is Tamaya DeBarge.
Evening, everyone. My name is Kayvon Sherry, and today I'll be focusing on how British and French colonialism reshaped African gender roles. To understand these changes, it's important to first look at what African gender systems looked like before colonial rule. Before Europeans arrived, many African societies operated under what scholars call gender complementary systems. This means women and men had different responsibilities, but both roles were respected and essential to how society functioned. For example, in West Africa, women were not confined to the home. They were major traders, controlling markets and long distance commerce, especially in places like Nigeria. Some women held powerful political roles and military positions. A famous example is Queen Amaya of Zazu, a 16th century warrior queen who was spending her kingdom through military conquest. Women also served as spiritual leaders, healers, and advisors. Their authority was recognized alongside men's authority, not beneath it. Men and women worked together to sustain society, with no single gender viewed as inherently superior. So now let's discuss colonial impact. When the British and French first colonized Africa, they brought with them European ideas about gender that were far more different from the African system. Colonial government believed men should be the heads of the household, the political leaders, and the main economic earners. They dismissed African women economic and political power because it didn't match European norms. As a as a result of this, women lost significant political authority. Colonial administrations chose to work among exclusively with men chiefs, ignoring women who traditionally had leadership roles. Women economic power declined. Colonial politics restricted women trading activities and pushed them into low status roles like domestic work, small scale farming, or participating in Christian mission programs. Meanwhile, men were pushed into being wage laborers in mines, factories, and colonial projects. They were expected to fulfill the European idea of the male provider, even though this wasn't how many African society was originally worked. To illustrate this mindset, consider a British report from the 1910s that described African women as ideal. This wasn't based on reality. African women were running markets, farms, and business. But to the British, because these roles didn't match European women's domestic positions, they assumed African women were contributing at all. This primary source highlights the deep gender bias that shaped colonial policies. So now let's discuss this affecting legacy. These changes didn't disappear when African countries finally gained independence. Colonial rule left behind systems that continued to privilege men in politics, in the economy, and public leadership. This is why in many post-independent governments we see male-dominated leadership structures, women underrepresented in politics, persistent gender inequality in access to education, land, and economic opportunity. Colonialism didn't redraw borders, it reshaped gender roles, often reducing women authority and elevating men within systems designed to mirror European ideals. So in conclusion, when we talk about African gender dynamics today, we're not just looking at cultural traditions. We're looking at the long shadow of British and French colonialism, a period that imposed foreign patriarchy structures onto societies that had once valued a more balanced and complementary approach to gender. Thank you.
Colonialism didn't just rule India, it reshaped gender identities. Before the British arrived to India, there were diverse gender roles influenced by the caste system, and they used traditions to reshape such ideas on genders. Some ancient tax region customs gave women limited property, values, and educational rates. But under a colonial rule, new ideas about masculinity and femininity were introduced, enforced, and eventually normalized across generations and across the globe. For some, women were claimed to need help, especially by the British. British officials claimed to rescue these women, but this became a way just to justify an empire. Indian women were portrayed as helpless and needing European mortality, while men were feminized. Colonizers saw them as weak or feminine, especially compared to what they believed British masculinity was. Today, we can trace many of what we now see as normal modern gender expectations back to these colonial encounters that shaped India as we know it today. As the British settled, they didn't just bring their personal items like clothes, guns, weapons, all of this. They brought their beliefs. They carried their beliefs and ways of doing things at high standards, specifically their gender roles. They believed that men had to be rational yet dominant, strong, influential leaders, while women were believed to stay pure yet domestic, and solely dependent on the role of a male. Ironic. This belief of the role of a male and women made the view of Indian women and men completely opposite. Men were believed to be weak and overly spiritual, which in British colonies, mostly women of higher age, elderlies, were seen to show these type of traits. For women, they were seen to be the complete opposite, still pure yet oppressed. And colonialism created a crisis of identity. Indian nationalists responded by redefining masculinity. Now masculinity is strongest and most moral. There are many stories that we can hear about that shaped our idea of India and portrays men and women. As many of you know, the story Malala Yousafzai, a Palestinian female education advocate who also made history by receiving the Peace Prize in 2014 at just the age of 17. She shared her story and advocates for women and children in her native district. Her advocacy came with a lot of backlash and a lot of beliefs on whether or not women were to hold roles that were given. Her bravery and impact is what is helping shape the minds of young women all over the world today. She risked her life to show that little kids and females just like her should not be put in a box that claim who they can be, what they can be, and how they can be it. There's also a painting of British Membosai, Women versus Indian Servants. This painting portrayed the disparities between the females of the caste rule and the Indian versions of domestic servants and historical modern day dynamics between female employees and female domestic workers. It portrays that Indian female workers were often given a disadvantage of being used by the professional workers, while the Indian workers or domestic servants also show a lack of pay and benefits that were given by the female workers. In the painting that you can see, you see a lot of darker skinned people, which portrays the Indian people as being solely helpful to the British worker, and the Indian servants were not as shown to have been given as much pamper as the lady in the chair is showing. Like Africa and India, Latin American colonial stories often turn gender into a tool of control shaped by Catholicism and racial mixing.
I'm going to be talking about colonialism and how it transformed gender roles in Latin America. We often talk about colonialism in terms of land, resources, or religion, but it also had a powerful impact on how people understood gender. I'm going to start by looking at what gender roles looked like before the colonial contact, and then I'm going to talk about what changed under Spanish rule, and then lastly, we're going to talk about the long-term effects that we still see today. Before Europeans arrived, many indigenous societies such as the Aztec and Inca had systems based on gender cooperation. This doesn't mean everything was equal, but roles were usually complementary rather than hierarchical. Women were active participants in community life. In many regions, they served as healers who used botanical knowledge, as priestesses involved in religious ceremonies, and as traders in local markets. Men and women often worked together in agriculture. Both were responsible for planting, harvesting, and maintaining the land that sustained the community. Rituals and festivals also relied on both genders. Religious ceremonies might involve male priests performing certain duties while the women prepared offerings or led songs and dances that were equally essential to the spiritual processes. So overall, gender roles existed, but they emphasized cooperation rather than dominance, meaning that the men weren't taking over the important roles and they essentially worked together in creating equality. When the Spanish colonized the Americas, they brought European gender ideals that clashed with the indigenous traditions. Their goal wasn't to only conquer land. They also believed they needed to civilize indigenous people by reshaping their social structures. So for the women, the Spanish promoted the ideal of Marianismo. This was based on the figure of the Virgin Mary, and it encouraged women to be pure, obedient, quiet, motherly, and self-sacrificing. A good woman was expected to stay in the home, serve her husband, and model religious virtue. We might see this today. We might call it housewife or a stay-at-home mom. It's usually the woman who doesn't have a job. She stays at home. She takes care of the kids. She cleans. She cooks. She is devoted to her husband. She, dedicates her life to her husband and her kids. For men, Europeans encourage machismo, the expectation that men should be dominant, brave, aggressive, and always in control. Under this system, men were viewed as natural leaders in both the household and in society. These gender norms didn't just reinforce male dominance, they also reinforced racial and class hierarchies. European men placed themselves at the top of the social order, seeing themselves as the most masculine and civilized. Indigenous and African men were portrayed as less rational, less disciplined, and therefore less masculine, and this allowed the colonizers to justify political and economic domination. We actually see these ideas clearly in primary sources from the colonial period. Catholic missionary letters, for example, often describe indigenous women as souls to be tamed. This phrase reflects how missionaries saw indigenous women, not as people with their own knowledge systems or social roles, but as spiritually wild and in need of European discipline. Language like this helped justify the imposition of European gender norms and reinforce the idea that indigenous cultures were inferior. It also restricted the roles women could play in their communities by framing European femininity as the only correct model. The impact of these gender norms didn't end when colonial rule ended. We still see these effects today. For example, stereotypes of submissive, self-sacrificing women remain common in many parts of Latin America. At the same time, the expectation that men should be hyper-masculine, emotionally tough, and dominant continues to shape family structures, media portrayals, and social norms. However, there are strong movements pushing back against these stereotypes. Modern Latin American feminists are actively challenging colonial gender expectations. One major example is Ni Una Menos, a movement that began in Argentina and has spread across the region. It fights against gender-based violence, but it also challenges the deeper colonial ideas that women should be passive and obedient. Many activists are also reclaiming indigenous and Afro-Latin perspectives on gender, perspectives that value cooperation, community, and balance rather than dominance. Overall, colonialism didn't just reshape governments and economies, it reshaped gender itself. Indigenous societies had systems built on cooperation, but Spanish colonization imposed strict ideals like Marianismo and machismo that created lasting inequalities. These ideals still influence gender expectations today, but they're being challenged by powerful feminist and decolonial movements. By understanding where these ideas are coming from, we can better understand how to move beyond them and work towards equal societies and a world where men do not overpower women and we're all seen as one.